Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Rose Dyson, and I've been involved with Friends of Egerton Ryerson virtually since the beginning, when it was founded about 4 years ago. I'll start with our first speaker, introducing him, the Reverend Dr. Peter Wyatt. He's a former principal of Emmanuel College, which is the United Church Theological College at University of Toronto. He has served in the Canadian and international ecumenical movements and is engaged in the attempt of the Christian Church to open itself more fully to Indigenous gifts. And that's all he told me about himself. He'll tell you more later, I'm sure. He'll be followed by Len Fortune, one of our members. Len is partly Indigenous. From his Mi'kmaq maternal grandparents, he was a photojournalist student at the Ryerson Polytechnic Institute. His excellent brief on the Standing Strong Task Force is on the Friends of Egerton Ryerson website, which I encourage you to look at. There's lots of other papers there. And he is the author of several books on Indigenous people. So with that, I'll turn things over to Peter.
Thank you, Rose. I'm grateful to the Friends of Ryerson,
yes,
and the Deer Park Library for this opportunity to speak about Egerton Ryerson. And I'm pleased to be companioned by Len Fortune. The late Murray Sinclair said, "Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out." I see our gathering as part of such a venture. The received perspective on Ryerson these days is that he was the architect of the Indian residential schools. My own perspective differs and seeks to be contextual, to situate Ryerson's work as a missionary and educator within the overall historical context, and within the context of his own character and relationships with Indigenous people. I don't seek to discount the harm caused by the residential schools or the consequent responsibility owed by settler descendants to work for reconciliation and justice today. Nor do I wish to portray Ryerson as a man without fault. He shared the mindset of cultural and religious superiority toward Indigenous peoples common with settler people of his day. Nonetheless, there is lots of evidence that Ryerson was a supportive and loyal friend to Indigenous people. And I hope in the course of my remarks to show you some of that evidence. We are meeting today on land ceded to the Crown by the Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe people, in the Toronto Purchase of 1805, Treaty 3. We are treaty people. Egerton Ryerson was a Methodist minister and missionary and a pioneering educator, the founder of Ontario's free and universal system of public education. Before he was 30, he was arguably the most influential journalist of his day, as inaugural editor of the Christian Guardian, the weekly newspaper of the Methodist Canada Conference. On the controversial question of clergy reserves, the political issue of the day in Upper Canada, he was an outspoken champion of civil liberty and religious equality. He was a confidant of governors general and lieutenant governors, and based on British constitutionalism, an opponent of the revolutionary spirit that brought about the 1837 rebellion. He was also a friend of fellow Indigenous mission personnel. The discovery of unmarked graves at former Indian residential schools unleashed grief and rage in many Indigenous people. And some Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have sought to bring those responsible to justice, even if posthumously. And Ryerson has become the chief of those accused. Ryerson's statue at the then Ryerson University had been vandalized before, but in June 2021, a mob toppled it, managing to break off its head, which now sits atop a pole on the Six Nations or Haudenosaunee Reserve south of Brantford. If Ryerson were indeed the architect of the Indian residential school system and its deplorable aspects, such actions might be defensible. However, I believe that he has been made a scapegoat for the sins of many. Ryerson has been vilified because, at the request of the Indian Department of the Province of Canada, he wrote a letter in 1847 outlining a possible structure for Indigenous boarding schools. The envisaged schools would teach farming skills as well as academics and would be a collaborative venture between the missionary churches and the Government of Canada. Ryerson's letter, later styled a report, came late on the scene, since the idea of establishing such schools had been a matter of public discussion for almost 30 years. Moreover, some Indigenous boarding schools already existed, the result of collaboration among church, government, and First Nations leaders. The first part of my presentation is about the development of an idea. John Malloy's book, A National Crime, the Canadian Government and the Residential School System, has been influential for me. I have used it and other resources in developing an IRS, Indian Residential School, timeline showing how much occurred before and after Ryerson's 1847 letter. It was a lengthy process that led to the institution of the residential schools by the Government of Canada in 1883, a year after Ryerson's death. Let's look at the development of an idea of what was usually referred to as manual labor schools. Timeline 1. Can most of you read text on this screen?
Yes.
Sometimes I would like to just let you read it because things will happen faster. So if you can kind of keep that in mind, that would be great. So in 1820, Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland was the first to propose the idea of native boarding schools to the British Colonial Office. And that idea fell to the ground because there was no interest in the proposal. It was believed that Indigenous North Americans were incapable of being educated. In 1828, Major General Darling, Chief Superintendent of Indian Affairs, completed a review of the work of the Indian Department, and he called for it to focus on the project of civilizing, engaging with Indigenous people. In 1828, the Mohawk Institute was founded by Anglicans on the Six Nations Reserve south of Brantford. You see, already in 1828, an Indigenous boarding school came into existence. Timeline 2, Colonial Secretary George Murray shifted British policy from that of nations somehow existing in separate, unrelated cultures, as if that were possible, to the project of civilizing Aboriginals, including educating their children and youth. 1837, the Canada Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church resolves clearly, the Methodist Conference believed that the project merited the support of its own newly established academy or college. An important matter, the education of Indigenous children. In the years 1842 to 44, the Bagot Commission met over those 2 years and recommended at the end of it all that while maintaining the successful Indigenous day schools, boarding schools should be established. Timeline 3. Chief Peter Jones reports to Ryerson the good news that the Mississauga of the Credit have subscribed liberally to support manual labor schools. 1844, a Methodist boarding school was established at Alderville to be followed by one at Munsey, west of London. And in 1845, 2 bands of Chippewa, another brand of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, one of Moravians, who were they? Delawares maybe, and one of Mississauga commit 1/4 of their crown annuities to build the school at Munsey. So to underscore the significance of the timeline so far, plans for residential schools had been made well before Ryerson wrote his apparently infamous letter, and a few of them already existed. In 1846, Superintendent General Thomas Anderson of Indian Affairs convoked a gathering of Indigenous chiefs and leading men at the Orillia Narrows to discuss the desirability of establishing manual labor schools. Almost 100 chiefs and leading men attended, mostly Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, as well as Mohawk chiefs and others. And the majority were strongly in favor of establishing manual labor schools, agreeing to give up their crown annuities to finance the operation of such schools. It was in 1846 that Ryerson submitted his report on a system of public elementary instruction for Upper Canada. This report ran to 200 pages and was the template for so much that happened at the beginning of the Upper Canadian Canada West Ontario educational system. And in 1847, Ryerson wrote his apparently infamous letter at the request of the Assistant Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. In 1879, the Davin Report, commissioned by the government of the new Dominion of Canada, called for an Indian residential school system based on the model of United States Indigenous boarding schools. This report does not mention Ryerson or his letter. It's only in 1883, though, that the IRS began to be instituted, and Edgar Dewdney, the Indian Commissioner for the West and a confidant of John A. Macdonald, led the way in establishing them. Now, in 1898, Ryerson's 1847 letter only became a report when it was attached to an annual Indian Affairs statistical report on residential schools. And the appendage seems almost accidental, since it never appeared before or after in the public record. At the conclusion, by the way, of his handwritten letter, Ryerson says, "I submit these observations, suggestions, and hints, such as they are, to the indulgent consideration of His Excellency in the Indian Department." Not exactly a report. When Ryerson wrote a report, it ran to 200 pages. He was contributing some ideas to the process of following up on the establishment of schools promised to the Indigenous chiefs at the Orillia Narrows. In 1920, a bill to amend the Indian Act was presented, but not passed until 1933, to make IRS attendance compulsory wherever there wasn't a day school on the reserve. So Milloy has as the chapter title of his chapter 3, Founding Vision of IRS 1879 to 1920. It's the Davin Report that explicitly advocates assimilation through education at schools away from the influence of parents and culture. It was this vision of Indian boarding schools that the Government of Canada instituted. And while Malloy identifies the Davin Report as the true beginning of the IRS process, he says there's certainly no single route from which the Canadian residential school system can be seen to have grown. Not Davin, not Dewdney, not MacDonald, not Maitland, not Anderson, and certainly not Ryerson. No single individual can be targeted that way. And Malloy clarifies further that the project of civilizing Native people through assimilation was a national project of the young Dominion, embraced by almost all as the proper approach to relationship with First Nations. So you have a decades-long development. And you can't draw a straight line from any of the proposals over that long period to what the Government of Canada actually established, based on the Davin Report. And I hasten to add that the system that was established could have been other than it was. It could have been voluntary and bilingual. It could have been adequately funded by government. It could have included Indigenous leadership on the teaching staff. And it could have been based on loving interest and concern, and not heartless regimentation on the part of some superintendents and teachers. The school that could have been actually existed at the Credit Reserve when Ryerson was there as its minister. Second part of my presentation. At the end of hostilities with the Americans, when the War of 1812 finished, the Indigenous nations were no longer needed as allies, and so could be taken for granted. And coupled with this was the incoming numbers of settlers from Britain and also from the United States, who were squeezing onto territory that had been the traditional people's hunting grounds. There was also the impact of diseases and the whiskey trade, both brought by white settlers. And so the Indigenous population was decimated in numbers and demoralized in spirit. And at the beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s, there were both settler and Indigenous observers who pondered the possible extinction of the Anishinaabe. I have the portrait of Tecumseh inserted to remind us that while the situation, can you give us the Tecumseh picture?
Oh, sorry, it says it's there.
Good, excellent. To remind us that the situation of the Indigenous people of North America, while it was dire, was not without leaders drawing from their own culture to resist settler domination. Tecumseh, Shawnee chief and fearless warrior, sought to unite all First Nations in a confederacy to resist United States expansionism. And he led Indigenous warriors supporting Great Britain in the War of 1812 and was killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. There were other Indigenous leaders resisting settler domination. One was called Handsome Lake, a Seneca prophet who was responsible for the recovery of the religion of the Longhouse on the Six Nations Reserve. And there were also great Christian Indigenous leaders who sought to resist settler domination and to obtain justice for their people. Among the Mississauga chiefs Joseph Sawyer, and Peter Jones. Among the Mohawks, Chief Thomas Davis and the Reverend Moses Walker. Now, into the context of dislocation and decline came missionaries of the Methodist Episcopal Church of the United States, bringing the gospel message to scattered settler communities and to indigenous communities. Canadians like the four Ryerson brothers responded to the call to ministry. The Methodist preachers were circuit riders, traveling on horseback from one small settlement to another, as the revered John Wesley had done in Great Britain. And Wesley, by the way, died only in 1793. So these Methodist preachers had a pretty strong link with this personality of Wesley. And a desire to do good to both settlers and native people led these missionaries to come and led Canadians to respond and want to be part of it. So here's Egerton Ryerson in a brief statement of 1826 to the Missionary Society. Next slide. So the camp meeting was a key feature of the Methodist mission. The 3 or 4 day gathering for prayer, preaching, singing, exhortation to be saved. And often settlers and indigenous people worship together at camp meetings and also in chapels of the Methodist Church. And the journal of the Reverend Peter Jones mentions at least 10 specific occasions on which he was present when natives and newcomers worshiped together. So now a little bit about Ryerson. His beginnings, born in 1803 near Port Ryersea on Lake Erie, where his father Joseph, a loyalist, had been given a land grant after military service during the American Revolution. And Joseph and the 3 elder sons also served in the War of 1812. Egerton was the 4th son. He was educated by private tutors at grammar schools in London and Hamilton. At age 16, he was also invited to do some teaching in London. And when at home on the farm, he studied from 3 to 6 a.m. before the working day started. Ryerson grew up in his family's Church of England faith. However, at 17, under the influence of Methodist preaching, he experienced a life-altering vision of Christ that led him to join the Methodist Church and to begin to become one of its ministers. Of the impact of his mystical experience of Christ, he said, "New views, new feelings, new joy, new strength." This moment was pivotal for Ryerson, and pivotal for understanding all that he did, all that he was to say and do in public life. He was first and last a Christian and a Methodist minister, and his motto in public life, a silent motto that he carried, the cause of God, not private considerations. So we have to skip over a couple of slides that give you an account of what it was like to be a circuit rider, to press on with the main theme. At age 23, Ryerson was assigned to serve as resident minister to the Mississauga Nation of the Anishinaabe, who were already Christians at the mouth of the Credit River. And his lodging was first in a wigwam. The band had settled at the mouth of the Credit on a land grant of 4,000 acres, part of their traditional hunting and fishing grounds. They received the land grant as part of the surrender of territory encompassing the Bronte Creek and the Credit River in Crown Treaties 22 and 23. Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland, impressed by the progress of the Credit Anishinaabe, had 20 houses built for them. And while the Mississauga had been granted this land by the Crown, they had no title deed. Of his first weeks on the charge, Ryerson said, "I feel an inexpressible joy in taking up my abode with them. My heart feels one with them." Now this slide is unfortunately cut off. It's a poster advertising the sale of land at what is now Port Credit. The Mississauga were crowded out in 1847 by pressure from settler squatters. And by the way, recently the government of Canada promised $30 million to the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation as the beginning of compensation for the loss of their land at the Credit. And current Chief Salt says that they may establish an urban reserve in the GTA. But this poster is for the sale of the Mississauga land at the mouth of the Credit. Throughout the pastoral year, 1826-27, Ryerson was immersed in the life of the Mississauga, leading Sunday services, conducting daily prayer meetings, and learning enough Ojibwe to be able to lead a class meeting in the tongue of the Mississauga. And this was to cries of joy when they heard this. He also used skills learned on the family farm, so that he said, "I became head carpenter, head farmer, as well as missionary among these interesting people." Now, in resistance to unchecked settler encroachment, Ryerson petitioned the colonial government to give the Mississauga exclusive right to their traditional salmon fishery on the Credit. It didn't happen. The legislature did not grant it. But in gratitude for this and all his efforts on their behalf, and in recognition of his boundless energy, the band honored him with an Ojibwe name. And the senior chief, speaking in Ojibwe, gives Ryerson the name Chichok, the name of a recently deceased brother of his. As you may know, the granting of an Indigenous name to a settler person is no ordinary thing. It's an act of high regard and deep affection. And when in England, securing the charter for what was to become Victoria College, Ryerson also lobbied the colonial secretary, Lord Glenelg, to grant land titles for the land grants made to the Anishinaabe. Glenelg would ultimately agree, but he was swept from office in an election, and the titles were never granted. Here's a report that Ryerson made to Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland about progress at the Credit. Now this particular facet of 40 children attending the common school, and nearly 20 of them can write intelligibly and read the Holy Scriptures in the English reader. The scholastic opportunity that the children had on the Credit Reserve is remarkable. It's been estimated that at the time of Ryerson's ministry at the Credit, only 1 in 20 settler children had the opportunity to attend a school. But at the Credit, every child had a chance, and most became literate in both English as well as Ojibwe. Darren Wybenga, current manager of culture at the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation, said to me, "Ryerson was a friend of the Mississauga." Here's another book that I have found instructive, this one on Peter Jones. For it was at the Credit that Egerton Ryerson developed a friendship with Peter Jones, whose Anishinaabe name was Kakawakwanabe, or Sacred Feathers. Ryerson had indeed been present at the camp meeting several years before, when Peter Jones accepted God's grace in Christ and became a Christian. So this happened that Peter Jones responded to the gospel of grace on Methodist Mountain. Methodist Mountain was Ancaster, but it was called Methodist Mountain because so many Methodists lived there. Anyway, Jones became a chief of the Mississauga as a young man. He was the first Indigenous person ordained by the Methodist Church in Canada, and at the request of Methodist leadership translated parts of scripture and hymns into Ojibwe. Peter was also sent to Britain on 3 different occasions by the Methodist Conference to raise funds for Methodist First Nation schools. And along with Ryerson, the Reverend John Sunday and the Reverend James Evans was a petitioner for title deeds from the British government. And it was he in 1838 who presented the Anishinaabeg petition with tribal totems and wampum in an audience with Queen Victoria. And there he received the promise of the crown for title deeds. But as noted tragically, the government changed. There was a new colonial secretary, and nobody made sure that it happened. Historian Donald Smith says that Ryerson and Jones were pretty much blood brothers. Ryerson's admiration for Peter and the way that they truly were brothers is illustrated in a couple of matters. When the post of Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Canada West, that's what Upper Canada became in 1840, and that's what, of course, became Ontario. When the post of Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Canada West became vacant in 1854, Ryerson wrote a lengthy letter nominating Peter to take the post, a nomination that was sadly ignored. And when in 1856 Peter was gravely ill and then living near Brantford, he and his wife Eliza stayed with the Ryerson family for a month in Toronto while he received medical treatment. Peter died in April of 1856, and Egerton Ryerson delivered the eulogy. With Peter's death, a great opportunity was missed, an Indigenous superintendent for an Indigenous school. Peter was slated to become the first principal or superintendent of the Mount Elgin boarding school at Muncie, one of the projects for which he had been raising funds in Britain. Here's Peter in traditional regalia and in Western dress. The encouragement and ordination of Peter Jones is the outstanding example of the Methodist strategy to recruit and equip Native leaders to carry the mission to Native people. And often Peter began his prayers with, "O great and good Spirit." There were lots of others who served as ministers, interpreters, translators of hymns and scripture, teachers, and so on. It's a sad aspect of the Methodist mission that after 1850, administrators in the church no longer shared the vision of promoting Indigenous ministers and teachers for Indigenous people, including the ability to speak in native languages. However, I have discovered that among the Credit Mississauga, Methodist services were held in Ojibwe until 1871. And Ryerson, of course, belonged to the earlier leadership in its strategy of having Indigenous missionaries ministering to Indigenous people. Here's another taste of how Ryerson experienced being at the Credit Mission. "And love them as mine own people, So as you reflect on the shape of the Methodist mission in the first half of the 19th century and ponder the experience of Ryerson at the credit, does it seem possible that he could ever have endorsed tearing children away from their parents, prohibiting native language, going about with cruel punishments, and apparently being indifferent to the death of a child in the schools? So we move now to the third part of the presentation, the content of the 1847 letter. So at the Orillia Narrows, there was an agreement among the majority of the chiefs and leading men with the Indian Department that they would go ahead and deliver the goods on manual labor schools. And it was the Assistant Superintendent General, George Varden, who wrote to Ryerson seeking suggestions, the result of your observations and experiences in Europe, as you may conceive it to be useful. And then Varden confided his great anxiety to Ryerson about this project of establishing manual labor schools. You are aware that there are numerous persons in the colony who will alike rejoice in the failure of a plan which tends to place Indians on a footing of perfect equality with their white brethren. It's clear that Varden, government representative, Ryerson, shared a common concern for Indigenous people and saw that the goal of establishing what they hoped would be first-class institutions of learning for Indigenous youth so that they could succeed on an equal footing with settler youth. This is a far cry from trying to create a servant class, as is sometimes alleged to be the goal of these manual labor schools. So the goals of the school, as Ryerson envisaged them, this is content from the 1847 letter. Ryerson preferred to speak not about manual labor schools, but industrial schools. That's to talk about industry. Working farmer and mechanic, that of course was the vocation of most settler youth, and equal education was foreseen in Ryerson's sketch of the ideal residential school. Next slide, and this is a key, his religious impulse. But even a knowledge of the doctrines and moral precepts is inadequate without the additional energy and impulsive activity of religious feeling. You see, by religion, Ryerson didn't mean the inculcation of beliefs so much as the personal experience of divine, redeeming love that characterized early Methodist conversions, including his own. The church's government partnership that Ryerson envisaged was not a new departure. Most forms of education at the time were premised on the important role of religion. And in the project of equipping Indigenous youth to participate in the larger society, civilizing them, that's the language they used, church and many government leaders, like Varden, shared a common vision, and from the beginning of contact of the settler peoples with Indigenous peoples, this collaboration, church and state, religion, and the civil society went forward together. And such collaboration was already a reality in the existing day schools, both those for natives and newcomers. Part of the deal about education. Conditions for success, as well as proposing an integral role for religion in the schools, Ryerson's letter called for attention to the character and qualifications of those who would lead them. yeah, the people who are going to be the teachers, they ought to be a special kind of people. That was Ryerson's vision, and a key plank in his work as the General Superintendent of Education in Canada West was the establishment of normal schools. And OISE, Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, began as the Toronto Normal School. Expectations of the pupils. You know, the summer schedule had them working in the fields and learning things as they worked in the fields, 8 to 12, and then 1 to 6, and in the summer rising at 5. Remember, Ryerson rose at 3 to do his studies before he went out to work on the family farm. He just didn't know that anybody else couldn't keep up with him. So the lessons in the summer would be before breakfast and after supper, Sunday devoted to worship. You know, the hard work that was expected to try to keep these schools going seems, you know, wow, that's asking a lot of young people to work that hard and be up at 5 and so on. But if you haven't read Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush, it's instructive about what our settler forebears experienced in terms of surviving in the wilderness, and how every member of the family, children and youth, were all participating in the act of survival. So you and I have it pretty easy, or had it pretty easy. Let me say about the course of instruction. Just leave that one on the screen. What Ryerson had in mind in terms of academics was the study of geography, history, agricultural chemistry, drawing, vocal music, and bookkeeping, especially regarding farmers' accounting. He recommended that students in the school should have their own money and learn bookkeeping through the management of their own resources, so every student would get a penny a day and look after their own accounts. So this was the goal of the schools, the overall goal, to educate and to train successful farmers who would be the owners of their own land or overseers of some of the largest farms in Canada. So the basis of the economy of Upper Canada was agriculture, and Indigenous youth needed to be equipped to participate in the agrarian economy. And Ryerson and the other folk, the missionary personnel, believed that if Indigenous people took agricultural possession of the land that had been granted to them, they would not lose it to white squatters. That was a good thought, but it didn't work out. The squatters kept coming, and Indigenous people were pushed off the land. Okay, to sum up, I think the actual text of Ryerson's 1847 letter shows little sign of the deplorable aspects of the Indian residential schools that were instituted in the late 19th century. The terrible abuses that have transpired over time clearly could never have been intended by a man given the name Cheehawk. It's not just that Ryerson was only one among many who engaged in a public conversation about Indigenous learning in boarding schools. It's that the kind of education he envisaged was qualitatively different in spirit from the kind instituted and developed by the government of Canada. And so I say Egerton Ryerson deserves better than to be made a scapegoat for the sins of us all. I want to show you that one note, Joan, that you had up on the screen about the event at Victoria. This just came to my notice. Victoria, of course, was founded. The founding principal was Egerton Ryerson, and his name has been in eclipse. His painting doesn't hang on the wall anymore. People really. But a recent graduate, Shane Joy, is going to deliver a keynote lecture on September 30th at Vic, tracing Egerton Ryerson's shifting views on Indigenous education. I wish I could be there. Anyway, some of you might be interested in going to see what's happening there.
Yeah.
Okay, that's me.
Thank you. Can you give me the mic? Thank you very much, Peter. You certainly cleared up a lot of confusion on what Egerton Ryerson stood for. And I just remembered having gotten back from Saskatchewan, I went through a place called the Western Development Museum and saw some of the evidence of the competition between farmers on Indigenous reserves and the settler farmers. They were afraid that the Indigenous might overtake them in some ways, and there was at least one complaint that was featured. In those days, an Indigenous farmer had to pay $18 for the right to sell a cow, so there were lots of things that were holding them back. Anyway, Len, it's yours.